So, Scott, thank you.
Yeah, everyone here was here last time, right?
I missed last time.
You did? So,
I was here the first one.
Okay, so some of these slides, Liz, you care if I just angle this a little?
No, rock it out.
Is that cool?
Yes.
So some of the slides in the beginning are going to be repeat, but that's okay, because, you know.
Seen one tree, you've seen them.
Yeah, you've heard one of my talks, you've heard them all. Again, I'm Scott, Obla, all this stuff. Recent upgrade from associate ecologist to certified ecologist, like just to piggyback on your good news. And today is all about like construction. So remodeling, new driveway, landscape installations, anything like that. If you feel like chiming in, obviously, even tighter knit group, we can turn this into a discussion, no problem. And I'll just go through the slides like normal. And then if you see something that you want to talk about or say, chime in whenever. Hopefully you all realize how low-key I am at this point. So, trees and construction summary. I break it down like this. You know, let's pretend like there's a lot of construction workers / developers, contractors here also. This is how I would be approaching them. Less to a homeowner and more to like an on-site. So, you know, if you ever talk to somebody or a builder or your neighbor who's building or whatever, this is the kind of information that I'd like to, you know, why trees are preserved on site to begin with, which we already have covered the many benefits of trees, so I'll go over that a little bit, which will be redundant. Common problems for trees on construction sites, you know, and then mitigating those problems on the sites, and then timelines and plannings. It's very, very basic. You know, we basically have like, why do we want these trees to stay through this construction? What are problems this tree is going to face during construction? How do we fix those problems or stop those problems from happening? And then timelines and the planning, you know, of it are kind of what encapsulate the whole idea with before, during, and after construction. So we'll talk about like preservation versus retention. Most of the legal language in ordinances and permitting for construction activities on sites falls within the retention category. Trees must be retained. This amount of trees must be retained on site. The biggest problem with that is it doesn't necessarily mean preserved. So today I'm going to split that up and show you like, okay, what is the difference between preservation and retention, because you can retain something, but it will end up costing more in the long run if it's not preserved instead of retained. So that's something I'm working on, trying to change a lot of that language into like trees must be preserved, which will, you know, lead to a 3 to 5 year monitoring program instead, you know. No problem. So you can erase their picture. We created a whole calendar of no-show. So, you know, why trees are preserved on site, obviously benefits of all the trees, and then preservation versus retention is something I'll drive in today. Common problems for trees on sites. This might seem obvious, but I like to point them out anyway because I get real angry when I see them. Soil disturbance, root loss, compaction are the kind of the big ones underground. Mechanical damage, wind patterns, and drainage are the kind of like the macro scale things that I see. And then landscaping, pruning, and hardscaping, which oftentimes are plugged into, hey, we're all in the same tree family, so how could landscaping, pruning, or hardscaping be a problem here? Oftentimes the post-construction landscaping installation does more damage than anything else, and we'll go into some of that too. And then mitigating the problems for trees on sites, so planning and tree protection zones, super important. Traffic, deliveries, storage, waste, and cleanup. Low impact utilities installation, monitoring, pruning, and landscaping in a way that is tree friendly or tree, you know, preservation conducive. So, and then again, timelines and planning. So why are trees preserved? This is going to be really redundant since we covered it already, except for maybe you. So if you have any issues, let me know. But basically, because they're valuable, they can be assets. Real estate data is pointing to 20%, higher property value on two identical properties, one with mature trees or landscaping and one without, which we call like clean slate construction. So you see, a new house where they've clean slated the property and now they just dug these little 2-3 inch trees everywhere, which is great, and it's fine that they put trees, but when compared to a tree site or a site that has a mature tree that was preserved as opposed to retained, that's like a 20% difference in what they end up getting for the property at the end of it. And money is a good incentive for construction activities. Trees can reduce impact of stormwater runoff, taxes, clean water, slope stability, personal and social benefits. We covered that last time with the big piece of data that I like to hit home is the 80% recovery time for post-surgery patients. Government, HOA, POA, community regulations may require tree retention and protection. This is where I want to pull that retention word out and put preservation. But a lot of times that is what drives home, if developers and construction folks want to make their job as easy as possible, all the trees on site would be gone so they can go wherever they want, not have any obstacles. I've been on that side of things, starting at 14, I was a framer, and I worked different trades every summer, until I graduated high school, and then I was a superintendent for custom home building. So, this isn't a foreign area for me. I know exactly what happens from start to finish on these sites. Reduced heating and cooling, that's one I love. Carbon sequestration, all benefits of trees, right? So here's just the same diagram I showed last time. We can go back to this if you guys want later, but I'll get into the construction stuff. So this is just the same exact slide as last time for property value, mature tree, increases in cost and prices and value. We looked at this and we skipped over it last time, but this means a little bit more when I'm talking about construction. So, if you look at, property value increases. So how much percentage is the property value increasing by? So 18% if building lots with mature tree cover, right? 22% tree covered undeveloped acreage. 19 to 35, lots bordering suburban wooded preserves. That's like parks and things like that. Up to 37% increase in property value when there's open land that is 2/3 wooded, right? That's like my personal house. So then when you have yard and street trees, 2% mature yard trees. So that's, way lower, obviously. So preserving trees versus in a forest setting versus, trees in front yard landscaping. These are not big trees. 6 to 9, good tree cover in a neighborhood. 10 to 15, mature trees in high income neighborhoods. So this one is the only one that I kind of like because it's kind of like there's a big tree at a neighbor's house, my property value goes up. So I don't necessarily need it, but around here, that's really cool because everyone has big trees. So it's kind of like, okay, if we manage them correctly, we can get this compound effect of property value. Water trees and taxes, just another redundant from last time. Stormwater, erosion, clean water, things like that, especially living by the lake. We want these trees to stay on site through construction, especially if we're exposing the ground and there's going to be a lot of sediment movement, a lot of debris, dust, everything like that. We don't want to end up down here in the lake. Just another diagram of rain where you have on the left side no ground cover, on the right side you have good ground cover. We can revisit these too at the end, not a problem. Redundant, all the ecosystem functioning we talked about before, same thing. So then we get back into the trees and construction. So why are trees preserved on site? That's why. All the benefits we talked about last time, all the benefits I covered in the first talk, right? I love trees. They have lots of benefits. If we manage them correctly, the risks, get lower and the benefits get higher. So moving on to common problems for trees on sites, this is where we get into a situation where, I'm going to talk about a lot of different variables and things, but overall, if I could drive home one point, it would be communication between the people who are in charge. And from the very beginning, the person who buys the lot, they're going to talk to somebody, a developer, an architect, somebody in that general scheme of things. As soon as that happens, somebody should be talking about tree preservation at the same time, because usually when you get a lot that's wooded or partially wooded, you know, that's the first thing they're going to look at. They're going to draw a map and figure out like where the house is going to go. And that should not really be like, oh, on a map the house should go here, and then the second thing is what do we need to remove, or where can we do this? It should be, let's go to the site, make a plot, what trees do we have that are valuable, are any of them unhealthy? Maybe you can, you know, start to talk about where to move that building site, you know, with that as part of the decision-making process. So like communication from the very beginning, as soon as there's any discussion about developing a property, is key, you know, as far as like that goes. So soil compaction, that's a huge one. Obviously, just compacting the soil. We know from one of the other talks, you know, the soil, a healthy soil is full of air and water space, so that we can get that gas exchange going. Water can come in, move through, up and down, all around. When you compact a soil, that becomes a lot harder. So tree roots have to either travel further or they just get cut off. You know, so compaction is a really big issue, especially when you bring in machines or vehicles that are, you know, about 7,000 pounds is kind of the rough borderline of where you get permanent compaction. So, you know, if you have a truck with, if it's a dually, you have a little bit more because it's all based on pounds per square inch, right? So the more wheels, the better. If you have a tracked machine, you know, it's better as far as like how much weight you can gain, but like this excavator right here probably weighs about, you know, 18,000 pounds, maybe 12 or 15 without the bucket. But, you know, if it's just tracking one way or another, you know, usually that's okay. I say that like okay, but as soon as it turns or as soon as it lifts up something and reaches that maximum capacity of, you know, whatever it is, like 18,000, 9 or 10 tons, then you have a big problem where you can't just uncompact or decompact the ground at that point. It's permanently compacted, it won't buffer itself back up, and gas will be trapped underneath, and water will be trapped on top, and there won't be an exchange anymore. So removing topsoil, that's like going out here and just, you know, scraping all the organic material off the top, and what you're left with is either, if they get down to clay, you know, that's pretty far, but most of the time, if they're digging for a house seat, they'll just dig through the clay, and then they'll flip everything up and sculpt what's left back. So you end up with clay everywhere, and then, you know, the topsoil is underneath all that at that point. And as that decomposes and rots, it creates cavities and holes and things like that. It's a big problem. So removing topsoil takes away that sponge layer that we like, you know, for tree roots and water management. Adding fill is another very common problem. And when I say like removing or adding, trees are their negative effects start at 1 inch. So if you add 1 inch of grade or take away 1 inch of grade somewhere, there could be a problem, especially in that critical root zone that we talked about before that we'll go over again, you know, with the math. So adding or removing any kind of soil, when they add soil, they usually add clay, and if they add topsoil, it's usually just sand and pine fines. It's not necessarily like, you know, good organic material that used to exist there. It's kind of just this constructed, you know, fake topsoil. Root cutting and trenching is a huge problem, usually because it gets covered pretty quickly, and we never really figure out like where that is. You can't have, there's no machine that, oh, these roots were trenched, unless you have a, you know, there's several ground penetrating radar devices out there, but it's very costly, and it's, you know, it'd be really difficult to find, and even if you found it, you couldn't do anything about it at that time. So root cutting and trenching is my #1 pet peeve. Mechanical injury, that's a no-brainer. That's just usually lazy work or somebody not paying attention. They move something around, they back into a tree, they hit a tree in a certain way. I think I have a separate slide, not yet. So mechanical injury is something that could be easily prevented with flagging and barriers that is commonly, you know, it'll lead to a problem 5, 7 years down the road. So it's not really looked at as a big problem. Oh, I nicked that tree, sorry. Let me show you the kitchen countertops. Like that's usually how it's done. New wind exposure, that's something we've talked about in here before. When you start removing certain parts of the forest or other trees, and you're exposing inside forest trees to outside environments, that can cause risk. And wind is the biggest one, where a tree has grown up, protected its whole life, and now it's exposed. And then, it doesn't have the stability or structure to withstand big hurricane winds or, even storms like we just had. Disturbed water availability, that could go either way. Too much water is going into this area now, or not enough. So, if you think about an area with a flat yard, if you increase the grade in the center by 1 inch, now all the water that lands to the right of that increase will go this way, and all the water that goes the other way, right? So 1 inch can change the entire dynamic of where water flows on a flat surface. So if you think about that on a slope, a slight inch grade can act like a berm and divert water one way or the other. A driveway does the same thing. A ditch does the same thing. Could be good or bad, depending, but it's just something to be aware of when you're looking at this kind of stuff. Toxic leaching is another one that is kind of like every single rule and regulation I've read about construction and permitting and this always requires a lined gravel pit for a dumpster. I've never seen one. As long as I've been in this business, I've never seen that done correctly. But it's in every piece of literature. It's in every regulated body. They're supposed to have basically, plastic sheeting, industrial grade, in a pool type thing. Fill that up with number 5 gravel, and that's where the dumpster goes on top of that. So when it rains and everything in the dumpster is leached down, it goes into this gravel pit. At the end of the construction, because they'll move the dumpster and dump it, bring it back and fill it back up and dump it. At the end of construction, they're supposed to collect that toxic waste dump and haul it off somewhere appropriately. I've never seen it done in my whole, career or life. Has anyone here seen that? It's like a really funny thing that exists just for like paperwork, I guess. But it's like it's something that should be done way more often, if it should be done at all, really. So and then landscaping and hardscaping, that could go either way.
Scott, can I?
Yep.
So you've done your best to save your trees where you want them and so forth. Now it's time to put in like a sidewalk and a driveway and so forth. I mean, is it possible to overlay anything onto the root structure?
Oh yeah.
So if you do it properly, I guess it's possible so you don't have to zig and zag your way around.
Yep, absolutely. So I'll do a real life example of this. So we have a contract with the Asheville Municipal Golf Course, and they got some work done that was done by an unqualified company. They got like beat up in the public eye for it. They cut off branches that shouldn't have been cut off. They were, they flush cut limbs, big wounds in giant heritage white oaks. They did not a good job as far as like doing what they're supposed to do for the trees. So they asked us to come in and do a big, kind of a reconnaissance plan. And part of this plan included protecting this one specific big white oak, maybe 28, 30-inch diameter. And the part of their whole plan included new cart paths, right? And one of the cart paths was going to come relatively close to this white oak, within 15 feet. And the oak's critical root zone surpassed that, by far, right? So they asked us, hey, what can we do? We need a cart path here, which is asphalt, like a little mini highway right through there.
We have a few of those around.
I've seen a couple, driving in. I noticed you have a couple. So, typical construction of a cart path is they dig a kind of a wide, shallow footer, anywhere between 6 to 12 inches deep. They dig that out. They fill that in with, gravel sometimes, whatever, and then they pour their surface on afterwards. So in the idea of moving forward to protect the trees they have, but also go through with their existing plan, what we did was we took an air spade, which I'll cover some more later on what that is, but it's basically a giant supersonic air gun that disrupts soil and, exposes tree roots without harming them. Like, you can dig and blow all the soil away. So we took their plan for the cart path and we air spaded down, about 12 inches in the exact location of the cart path. And when we encountered any roots, we went 8 inches back and cut them with sterilized tools. Just like that. We exposed, there was barely any there because it was an old cart path. It had a lot of compaction anyway. Aerated it, cut the roots, and then we formed a berm, that was built up on the slope side, so that the only thing that they had to do to build the cart path was lay down road bond and then their asphalt on top of that. So we pre-aerated underneath the entire cart path so that there was an existing, aeration, 12 inches of aerated porous soil that could withstand the amount of compaction that was going to happen. And then we told them, keep your machines off of it. Like, don't roll over this area until you're ready to roll the asphalt. So by the time they added the road bond, now you have like 12 inches of really aerated soil with no roots in there. And then they added 4 inches of road bond on top of that. And then they poured their asphalt. And it ended up costing them a lot less because they got, they paid me for a half a day. And they didn't have to have the excavator excavate the area out. They poured their asphalt. They just went on, and we've been monitoring it ever since, and it's totally fine. And the only thing we added was 6 to 8 inches of mulch on the tree side for a machine to be able to go there to deliver the road bond, and that prevented any permanent compaction over the roots. So, you can dig below roots with this air spade and run utilities under roots. You can do a sidewalk. If you're doing a sidewalk, a lot of times, depending on what it is, we suggest, permeable surfaces now are very common. You can buy concrete that water can soak through, pretty easily. Asphalt, same way. You can do, permeable asphalt driveways, things like that. But the main point of it is to not let somebody rip the roots with an excavator to begin with, and then to provide enough of an aerated area or mulch to where it can withstand the compaction that will take place on top. And then after that, it's no big deal at all for the tree. The tree has its roots.
But you did have to cut some.
We did have to cut some
and that
roots.
doesn't do any long-term damage.
So that's very specific to the situation. But if you cut a root cleanly with a clean tool versus ripping it underground, the likelihood of it surviving and sprouting is the same as pruning the top out. Not topping, but like, let's say I wanted to prune a branch. If I'm cutting it with a clean cut at a node, just like we talked about before, like cutting it at a place where it has a lateral root, it will promote lateral root growth as opposed to root death, which is when they're ripped, that leads to root death pretty quickly, and that decay can work its way back into the trunk of the tree. So preventing that from happening is the number one important part. So if you investigate, there is a root in the area, and it's not a structural root, within 3 to 5 times the diameter of the trunk, you can cut it cleanly at a specific location and promote that root growth along whatever pathway you're constructing. And it usually ends up very positive for the tree, and then you get a path or a concrete or whatever. Driveways are a little tough, just because depending on the type of driveway you want to do, whoever's pouring the concrete I'd want to work with them for their form depth. What they end up pouring their forms onto can be manipulated, but if they want to go down and keep the concrete driveway flush with the ground, that's a lot more difficult to deal with, But as far as, if you can build up, that's much easier to deal with as far as like root protection goes. So this is just a good example of like what good soil versus compacted soil looks like. Just like I talked about underground. So good soil, lots of air space, lots of pore space. You know, compacted soil creates this compaction zone where water stays on top and gas is trapped underneath. You know, this is a healthy soil that water and gas can just cycle their way through up and down. Where this side will pool very quickly, and the gas exchange under here will end up leading to an anaerobic environment where root rot and things like that can happen pretty quickly.
Todd, I'm assuming that once the ground is compacted, there's not any way to bring it back, like tilling or anything like that could add air and whatever.
So the same tool that I use for exposing is what I would use to aerate the ground. There's several options to do. So let's say a tree was growing and the entire area was compacted. What we would do is, you know, you'd start at the trunk and do a basic root collar excavation. You'd expose the buttress roots. And then what I do is called radial trenching. I would aerate like sun rays out from the trunk and try to promote the new root growth in those aerated trenches. And you can fertilize at the same time. You know, it's a lot harder and it would be really costly to do the entire area. But I've done it before for, there's an 8.5 foot diameter willow oak down in Morganton that we've been doing that for. It's on a historical farm. It's a huge tree, but we aerate the entire bed. You know, it had like a 15-foot mulch bed when we first got there, and now it has like a 100-foot mulch bed. And we aerate the whole thing every time. And you can introduce things like biochar, which has like more, you know, there's like more surface area for a piece of biochar than like any other material. So it's really good at creating pore space. So as it's incorporated into the soil, you know, it creates that space and expands and allows soil to kind of regain itself. But you can start by just doing radial trenching. You can do, you know, the simplest would be 4 directions. The next would be like 8 directions. And then, you know, depending on how bad shape it's in. But there's definitely things you can do. You know, there's not many things you can do physically, like with a tiller, because you're going to sacrifice the root loss for the soil benefit. So I would stick with air penetration, forced air, and then there's also water, which is kind of more old school. They take this kind of probe that's attached to a pressure washing type device, and they inject water underground. It's okay for areas that are needing like extra water underground, but it doesn't necessarily aerate the ground because there's not really air pushed into the ground, it's just water. So it kind of saturates, and a lot of times it leads to this like underground water pooling, you know, which it's better than nothing, but that's kind of the old school thing before they invented this air spade. Or air knife is another tool, same thing. But so yeah, so soil compaction, heavy machines, tracking and turning. Turning with a track is like big problem because we all know the absorbing roots for most trees are within 4 to 6 inches. So you have a big track machine, even if it's not compacting the ground permanently, if it turns one time like this, it's going to rip every single root underneath of it immediately. And you know, I don't know if you've seen, a really good operator won't turn on a dime. They'll kind of arc their way around. And that's how it's supposed to be done when you're going through a sensitive area. If they're turning in position, you should ask them like, hey, how long have you been doing this? You know, like, and the other way that they can turn well is they'll put their bucket down and they'll turn on their backs, if you've ever seen that done. They'll lift the front of their machine up and turn with the bucket like that. And it's less of a circus trick and more of a way to keep the ground, because they don't want to get out of the machine. So like when they have to regrade everything, they don't want to sit there and, you know, comb through it with their bucket. They like to, like, you know, leave. So arcing, you know, big curves, better, you know. So improper material storage is a big one for, you know, you get an order of trusses or pressure treated lumber delivered, and that can weigh several tons, and it can just sit in the same place for 6 months. You know, we've all been there if we've done any construction activity, right? So that's a big problem that is oftentimes overlooked. Like, any material storage for too long in the same place, if it rains and then that soil becomes wet and that pressure just goes down further, it never has a chance to bounce back. There's no more air, cycling. It's covered. Daily traffic and parking, basic vehicles in and out, blah, blah, blah. Heavy foot traffic even. Heavily foot trafficked areas can cause permanent, compaction if it's enough and in a sensitive enough place. So less like a residential construction and more like, everybody parks in this parking lot and they cut through this piece of woods to get to somewhere. All of a sudden there's problems because 200 people are walking back and forth every day. Hiking trails are a big area of compaction. And we think, we all like the idea of, a hiking trail must be nature friendly, but it's oftentimes it's another road, in the woods, because usually around here the hiking trails are, built in such a way where it's just kind of compacted clay on the ground. Very rarely, Lake James has a really good example of a good single track trail where they have organic material in the trail. Like you're walking on, it's like you're in Oregon or Pacific Northwest, and you're walking on organic material already, not just like hard clay, But anyway, that's a different talk. But that's the idea of it, is you want that organic material, spongy, softer, type stuff. Sculpting and packing contour. So that's a big one. When they're sculpting and scraping and packing things in so that it's all nice and tight and easy to see, that's all compaction. They're compacting everything. They're putting clay in areas. They're creating pottery out of a landscape. Which takes a lot of skill, but maybe not necessarily the best thing for trees if you have trees within that area. Soil structure inverted, like I talked about before. When you're looking at naturally existing soil structure, you have organic material. Around here, it can range from 5 to 17 inches is a natural organic material thickness, and that's like not just the leaves on top, but as that breaks down, you get into that black, loamy stuff, and then you have the white, mycorrhizae, and then if you dig into that forest area, you'll come up with all sorts of different stuff, and as you dig further down, it gets a little harder until you get to the clay. Most construction sites will just go scoop and flip, just like we talked about before, to where they're just kind of flipping that structure upside down and creating instability in the long run. That's like the clay versus organic material fiasco. So root damage, here's a good example of trenching. This is trenching for utility lines. So utilities, downspouts, and irrigation all come with the same idea. They bring that big, looks like a toy chainsaw on wheels, and they trench down, and they just kind of go in between trees wherever they need to go, usually. And if they hit roots, they have a regular chainsaw, and they cut them, and then they fill it all back in, and everything looks fine because it's all filled back in and the trees are still alive. But usually it takes about 3 years for a tree to show signs of distress post-trenching or post-construction. Grade changes, exposing or covering roots, both problems. Scraping and turning, like we just talked about. Removes absorbing roots, ripped by tracks is a very common problem. Roads and driveways, the diversion of water is a big one. So, you have a slope that's woods, a driveway goes in here. Usually on a driveway there's a ditch or something that takes water to a culvert. All that water that used to just run down like this or underground into here is now being diverted and pushed away, which is fine if you plan for it ahead of time. Footers and pilings, so, not necessarily even the damage that is caused at first, but when you dig a big, deep footer, right, they fill that up with gravel, and then they pour concrete in. And that's how a footer is, right? So that area below the concrete and to the bottom, it's usually they go down with, around here, at least they call it hard pack. You got to get down to the hard pack. The hard pack is clay. It's hard clay. So you have clay, and then you have gravel, and then you have concrete. Stability-wise, that's great for a house. But as soon as water gets into that gravel area, if there's any roots anywhere near it, it's going to create an anaerobic situation where it's just underground water sitting there rotting and decomposing and whatever. So the house will probably stay fine, it won't slough off or anything, but when that water, you know, if it doesn't have anywhere to go because it's not high enough to exit in the normal water table, the entire water table will go down to try to get to it because now there's like this reservoir underground that's kind of changing the way that water is collected underground. Just something that not that many people think of, but usually when you think of footers, you know, they're way deeper than the surface. And then there's that space between the concrete and the ground that always has water in it. That's why they give you foundation drains. You know, they don't want water going into that concrete area, but they don't do anything with the water underneath because it doesn't affect the house. But it does affect everything else surrounding as far as like water moving underground, because that's just as important as water moving above ground for trees. So here's another classic example of an area that had a tree preservation, you know, or a tree retainment program. This is the fence that they use to block off, you know, people from hurting the tree. And then, you know, they dug this and they put it here. So that's like, you know, a grade change, right? So there's, you know, there's a grade change there. You know, there's some grass over here. That looks okay. And then, you know, 5 times this, let's say it's my hand, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You know, they got to about here. And there's, you know, the likelihood of that tree surviving is probably very minimal. But by the time they were done, they probably had this fence here. They probably took some of this dirt, pushed it back in, and then, you know, made it look really nice. And they had this fence here, so, you know, it's usually not an issue. They probably, you know, they probably were applauded for saving the tree. And then 3 years later, oh, why is the tree dying? Oh, some other reason, you know, like some other, whatever, I don't know. It was, we didn't do that for, it's been 3 years, you know. But, so this is a great example of like, you know, you can't just put a fence right here, right around the tree, and then expect this type of thing to happen and not lose the tree. Mechanical damage, again, dump trucks, trailers, excavators, materials, dumpsters, vehicles, ladders, fencing, signage, and facilities. So that's like porta johns and stuff like that. So, you know, has anybody been lucky enough to been on a site where they come and clean the porta john? So that when that happens, that is not a contained event. So like, you know, that is, and I'm not saying there's poop everywhere, but the chemicals they use to clean the porta john just goes out wherever. Usually that's right in the place that's like further away from the site. So on the edge of the woods, by the trees they're trying to protect, somewhere in a more sensitive area. Then, you know, Griffin comes in, they back up, they suck everything out of there, and then they spray it all down. And usually it's a bleach-based product, and it just goes into the ground and everywhere, just like that, you know. And it smells like, you know, Sam's Club for a couple days. Got Marsha on that one. So, mechanical damage ends up looking like this at first. So you have, you know, this is like where a track rubbed up against the bottom of the tree. A little, you know, oh, that's no big deal, but this will eventually lead to the whole tree needing to come down because, especially if it's anywhere near the house. You know, we've disrupted the circular connection of the cambium, so this whole section will die and rot. And the tree might live, but it's definitely not structurally, you know, it's not structurally, it doesn't have any structural integrity. That's what I'm trying to say. This is an example where, you know, they have a limb that got caught on something and ripped off. So now you have a ripped off limb. It's very difficult to fix this type of situation, you know, after the fact. There's things you can do like score and slice with a scalpel. I mean, it's really tedious and half the time doesn't work. But, you know, and then this is just a basic bump a tree, rip off all this, you know, all the bark and everything and expose it to. Usually pests are the biggest issue with exposure of that size at first because they're all drawn to this awesome syrupy goodness of sap. And they end up spreading diseases and fungus internally And then if the tree doesn't succumb to a structural problem, it's usually full of decay and pathogens, at that point. Same reason why we don't cut huge limbs off, ever. Because it's too big of a wound at once. It needs to be kind of reduced a little bit at a time. All right, so here's a good wind, so new exposures to the elements, right? I mentioned wind earlier. Here's a great diagram for why that happens. This is kind of like the species that are okay, but forget about the species. But this is kind of what more I wanted to say. So this is a natural forest structure. When you look at a forest that's kind of not been bothered with, and ends up happening, we put a house right here. These trees will disappear. You might have a small shrub and then these tall trees, right? These have never been exposed to the full wind, only the tops of them. So now these trees are exposed to all these different layers of wind, and they oftentimes pose risks. I just like this diagram because it kind of shows how a normal forest grows its own wind bubble or protective layer. That's why we had edge species. That's why species that are on the edge of forests are smaller. Dogwoods, redbuds, big one around here is rhododendron, mountain laurel, stuff like that. Stuff that sends the wind up and, over the tops of trees instead of right into it. And that's the difference between what we call a field-grown tree too. We mentioned that last time. It's like a tree that grows out on a farm will have that wind its whole life, and it be big and burly and have branches low and high and everywhere, big branches, and all those branches are stabilizing it in the wind. Versus a forest tree grows up skinny, no branches, and has a great canopy to access the sun, expose it, and now it's like a big popsicle type shape, right? So that's kind of the difference there. Sun scalding, so a trunk that's never seen the sun before is going to pop and fissure and crack when it's got full sun, especially if it's a thin bark tree like an American beech or a lot of the maple cultivars nowadays, things like that. Flooding, root loss, drought, canopy loss. Fire is one that is not necessarily that common here because we put out all the fires pretty quickly. But when it does happen, so this was a project we were working on in Asheville. I may have mentioned this before too, I'm not sure. But so this area was a new apartment complex going in, and about 4 years prior to this picture, there was a construction site fire. And that fire was enormous. And it spread and blew into our clients' condominiums. It singed everything on this side, and it came up. This tree had about 70 to 80% canopy loss. This other willow oak had, I think it was closer to 30 or 40 canopy loss. And this is 4 years later. You can see the scarring here. But they really wanted to keep this tree because the people that lived in these condos didn't want to just have to wait for, a new tree to grow up in the way of the new big giant complex that used to be woods. So fire in this case is kind of unique, but it's something I like to bring up because they would have never thought in a million years that they would have fire be a threat to the trees. So we worked with them. We saved these 2 service berries. We rehabilitated, and we rehabilitated all of these rhododendron all the way across the other side. They all ended up living. This is the worst tree that got it, but we were able to, we've since deadwooded a lot of this, and it's been reduced, but this was last year, and it's slowly creeping its way back, to decent health. And the people that live in here are just ecstatic. They still have bird activity. They have all the privacy that they had before. But it's taken 4 years in shade. Yeah, that's a big one. So fire is a problem. Hello. And then diseases, insects, and invasive species are all pretty, categorical as far as things that move in to cleared out areas, things that catch rides on tires and treads and dump trucks full of stuff and materials. That's how most invasive species, whether it be vegetative or insect, ends up moving throughout our communities. You know, they just hitch a ride on something else, and they get to somewhere and they, you know, start getting it on, and poof, there they go. So new exposures to these elements, you know, when we're talking about new construction sites, are very important, because a lot of times you don't have washouts. You don't have places where they're washing their tire treads before they come into this site, and you know, you can just follow. Usually, any road around here will lead you to Atlantis or Princess Tree or Bittersweet. You know, and they're really good at seeding and passing their seeds on and spreading around, and that's just how they work. You know, so it's just something to keep in mind for new construction when you're doing a clean slate type construction. Those invasive species will most likely outcompete everything else. That's what they're good at. So again, another good place to preserve the local trees and the health of those trees. That much more important to outcompete things that would otherwise take over. Toxic leaching. That's a big one that we just talked about with the dumpsters. So dumpster material, when it's uncontained, will just collect everything. Asphalt, paint, sealant, spray insulation, all that stuff that gets thrown away. If it rains one time, all that stuff has now leached into wherever it's going to, and it's usually not in that lined gravel pit that should be there. Pressure treated lumber, that can leach. Now it's getting better because it's heat treated versus treated with I forget the other chemical name, but it used to be treated with that yellower chemical. That if you got a splinter, it would usually mean you're in big trouble. Nowadays, it's more of a heat-treated, depending on where you get the wood. But it's less dangerous, but still something to look at. Especially when if you have piles of, things that can soak and sit there and rot themselves, and then they end up being thrown away. Just something to pay attention to. Cement truck washouts are a huge problem. They'll come in, they'll do their pumping, driveway, sidewalk, whatever, and then on the way out of the site, they will stop, and they have their own little water gun, and they just spray all their stuff, and it just goes right into wherever, and half the time they'll aim for a ditch, but it's not like that ditch goes to, where's that ditch go? Somewhere, usually here, eventually. So, that's a big one that I hate seeing, and I always bust them, and, it's hard to bust people around here when you're a tree person. But, I'm like, what are you doing? They're like, well, I gotta wash it out somewhere. I'm like, well, yeah, not, not right there. Like, at least wash it out, on the site that, at least stay where you are and wash it out. No big deal. But anyway, so that's something that bothers me. Tire treads, the spread of all this stuff, too. As soon as somebody drives through something, paint, whatever, they're just taking it right along. And it's not like a 100%, oh, this tree's going to die because you drove through this, but it's just something like the entire ecology of the system when you're looking at it. It's something we don't really want. We want to live here in a healthy, nice woods area with forests and beautiful trees and nice, fall colors and everything. To get to that stage, you have to start paying attention to this stuff, or it's kind of counterintuitive. Improper drainage, we already covered that. So, landscaping, I find about 5 or 6 properties every year with irrigation lines that were installed, between 5 and 10 years ago that were never looked at again. They installed them all for the new trees that went onto the site, and they end up looking like this. So, there's my old truck. Oh, I miss it. So, this is a basic irrigation line that was poorly installed. They just wrapped it around 3 times around a new tree. Long after the irrigation system stopped working, this existed. And the tree grew into it, and it girdled this side, And the tree was showing signs of stress. And the guy that hired me was like, I don't understand, we've mulched fine, and we do this and we do that, and within 1 minute, I started digging down, and I grabbed a rusty sawed staple, It was still kind of intact, but really sharp at that point. And I was like, oh, good thing I have tetanus. And so I grabbed that, and I was like, oh man, do you have irrigation lines in here? And he's like, yeah, but they haven't been working for 5 years. And I was like, yeah, but what about the lines? Are they still? And he's like, well, yeah, I think they're still in there. So I dug some more, and I found all this, pretty quickly. And this was probably one of 25 trees he had on his property that were just like this. And he invested a lot into the irrigation system, the trees themselves, mulching and taking care of everything landscaping-wise for a long time. And this was almost a death warrant. Like, I'd say gone another 1 or 2 years, and that whole tree would have just died, and they would have went to replace it or something like that. But yeah, this is a very, very common problem that I see too often. And it's just poor installation to begin with. I mean, irrigation shouldn't be installed like this for hardwood trees. Over mulching, so you get this weird, if you have a site that is mostly clay, if you put too much mulch on it, the water will stay in that mulch area and it will never leave. It'll just kind of stay in this new soil structure that you've built. So over mulching is just as bad as under mulching in some cases. So we like to stick to like 2 to 4 inches, 6 to 8 if you're doing a compaction relief. And that has to be, you can use that afterwards. But if you're doing a permanent mulching anywhere, 2 to 4 inches is the magical, thickness. Any less, and it's not really doing what it should. Any more, and you start to get, it takes a little bit more effort for that gas to get out, and a little bit more effort for that water to percolate down and start to break up that clay underneath. Irrigation lines, like I just talked about. Mass planting, so a lot of times you'll get these new sites, and they'll want to plant 50 skip laurels and 65 of this and 400 of these, and that ends up trenching and putting holes in the root system of the tree that they're trying to accentuate. So landscaping has to be a part of the plan from the beginning and incorporate everyone else in that same idea, because oftentimes we get through a construction project and it's the baton is just passed to the landscaping crew. There's no communication from before and after. Okay, we're done. We got the CO. We're out of here. And then they hire a different landscape company who's never seen the site before they come to it, and they start their own. Oh, you need this here and this here, and sometimes it works out great if you get a good person or a landscape architect involved. It works out fantastic. Sometimes it's opposite effect, and they end up putting landscape lighting in, which they end up trenching everywhere just for the lights, the light wires, outside, and they, it ends up being a problem that you were avoiding from the very beginning happening after you've already left, and it's like, oh man, like I can't believe we didn't just stay 3 more weeks on this site to monitor that part of it, ends up being an issue. So that's just something to pay attention to. Same as impervious surfaces with hardscaping. So when they do hardscaping, I always, whenever I install hardscape, I do, I'm a big fan of pacted road bond on top of, I do it like the Roman roads. So you start really big gravel, number 5 ballast, you go up to 3/4 wash, and then you put your packed road bond in at the top of that. So when the water gets through all of that, it spreads out like it should, and there's nowhere for it to get blocked up, right? On top of the packed road bond, then you have a layer of sand, and then you can put your flat rocks on top of that, and then pack it in with sand afterwards, or moss, or something like that. I'm a big fan of that type of installation, so that water can just move through and through in every direction, and then you have the roots able to follow that water and never uplift or cause any issue with a more of a permanent type installation. So I'm not going to waste your time going through these, but if you're interested in having this information, you can get it from the site. This is what I write into the reports as far as the impacts for what happens for the activity. So just do one example. Grade changes, reducing the grade, more than 1 inch. Cuts roots, decay, potential wind throw, and disruption of the natural soil environment. So these are the best management practices for ANSI standards. Grade changes, building the grade over 1 inch. Fill material over the root system can interrupt natural exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the soil environment, disturbing trees' biological process. Soil compaction produces the same effect and can also result in physical damage to roots. So this is, if I'm writing a report for a construction activity, this is what I use right here, the impact studies of all this stuff, just because it's been well researched and it's very well written as far as like what's actually going on with all these activities. Removal, clearing, stump ripping, you know, it's just very good resource to have when you're talking to construction folks. So again, common problems, we went through the problems. Mitigating the problems for the trees on site is what we'll talk about next. Any questions, any problems or comments? Yep.
So, I don't know if there's one answer to this or not, but so what comes first, the irrigation or the plant? In other words, if you were designing something, would you put the plants in first and then irrigate around them, or do you put irrigation in and then, or can it go either way?
My personal preference, don't put a plant in that needs irrigation. Right? So around here, you know, we live in a temperate rainforest. If you're putting in a plant here that needs irrigation, something's off, right? Something's wrong. Like it's either you've disrupted the natural water flow somewhere along the lines, and this area is not getting water. Irrigation costs a lot of money, so a lot of landscapers like to use it. If you lived in Savannah, Georgia, I would say irrigation is a must, you know, or West Coast, a lot of the southern, you know, southwestern states. They have to have irrigation if you want anything green growing. Here, irrigation should be limited, in my opinion, to above ground temporary irrigation practices or activities. So my methodology is always put a plant in that doesn't need more than 1 year of temporary irrigation. And that could be in the form of a tree bag that you fill up and it waters itself. You could put soaker hoses. I love soaker hoses as long as they're actively monitored. Soaker hoses are the best because you can manipulate them and really test where they're getting the water. Once an underground irrigation system is installed, it's very hard to monitor if it's doing its job or not, or if that water is getting to where it needs to get to for the plants. So, you know, let's say you're around Lake James area, very sandy soils, very well-drained soils, but you want to grow something that needs constant water. In that situation, the irrigation needs would be more along the lines of when I'm planting that plant, I would plant it a little deeper, and I would create that plant its own environment that can collect the rainwater better, you know, from the ground up. When I'm planting that thing, and I do my 5 times as wide hole, and I go a little bit deeper, and I put, you know, good organic loam in there, so it drained okay, but it wasn't this sandy material that existed before. You have to change the environment of the soil to meet the requirements of the plant. Otherwise, you know, you're kind of dependent on something, right? Just like if we get dependent on supplements or something. Like it's, you know, if that tree can't survive without irrigation, it probably shouldn't be there. If you want it to be there, you know, there's ways of going around it where, you know, you can install permanent irrigation. I would like to do it in a soaker hose surface level so you can adjust it, manipulate it, move it without disrupting the roots underground. Anything that's buried underground is going to be something that should never be accessed again, you know. And in that way, you should stick to the classic line irrigation on a slope where it's just lines like this, like a farm with drainage tiles, so that you have these lines that you can go back and access. Once the tree roots grow over there, there's not really any way to get to it anymore. So I would stick with, you know, soaker hoses on the surface, and that even includes like mulching over top of them. It's fine to hide it. For if you want a year or 2 years worth of irrigating, that's something you can do. But, you know, back to your original point, like, yeah, I would stick with the, you know, not necessary here. Where it is necessary, there's definitely irrigation techniques that I would use, and I would definitely put the plants first and then install my irrigation system, because after you install plants, that can change the topography of the ground, you know, enough. If you're putting the irrigation system in first, then you're kind of limited on what plants you need to put where and what size they can grow to. Just like around here, they don't like trees growing in septic areas, because, you know, as soon as those roots get into an area where there's holes or pipes, they will follow that water all the way through, you know, versus like very sandy soils like down southeast or southwest. Tree roots don't really follow that because water just drains quickly through sand. That's kind of my idea on that. Did I answer it or kind of make it more confusing? Okay.
I mean, this last summer was really dry.
Yeah. Yep.
That was difficult to keep things going.
Yep. So if I would recommend, depending on the size of your yard, invest in, 500 feet of soaker hose and put it out when you need to put it out. And, make sure that it's not oversaturating a certain area. And now soaker hose kits, like on Amazon, they come with like all their own hole punching. You can customize it. Like, oh, this needs this many gallons per hour if I'm turning it on, and I have this much cubic feet per minute water pressure. And I mean, there's so many options available for soaker hose installations. Like, the only thing I would recommend is getting the ones that are made in the USA. Just because.
I have a professional hose mover on staff.
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
So I'm okay.
Perfect.
I'm just talking for other people.
Yeah, for other people.
No, she's got some pretty high-priced talent helping her out.
Nice. There you go. And there's a lot you can do with just shaping dog bowls around the trunks of trees and shrubs, like giving them that dog bowl crater that can collect water. You pour a gallon in there and watch it. How quickly does it go out? Is your problem really the surface water just blowing right by, or is it the soil underneath? So really getting in there and creating these nice, beautiful, concave areas around the tree trunks is something that I promote all the time. So planning for tree protection, effective planning requires comprehensive understanding of two categories: every element of the construction design and implementation. So that's like from very beginning to the very end. I call that basically like from breaking ground to the, what do they call that? Like the checklist at the very end.
Punch list.
Punch list, yeah. And they go through and they put post-it notes everywhere. And everything in between that, right? And then specific and detailed information about the trees, that's the other part of it, right? And you want to match those two things together. And talk about them and compare, and is it worth it? Is it not worth it? What is our goals, etc. So this is something I made that I bring up to all the people involved. Like, this is what the communication map should look like for a construction site as far as the people that I think should be involved. You have the owner, who always wants to know everything, right? They start with they have the money and the idea usually, and if they don't have the idea, they're going to pay the architect for the idea. The architect should work directly with an arborist from the beginning, or a tree person, right? The arborist should also have contact with the owner for their personal goals and long-term goals for the property. So now you have this planning circle. From that, the architect is going to talk to the contractor. Hey, this is the plan. It's all paperwork at this point. We're looking at sheets of paper, and maybe they go to the site a couple times, look at the site. Now the contractor needs to talk to the arborist, who can now talk to the owner again. Hey, we can't do that. We need to do this. Okay, well, if you want to keep this tree, we're going to have to move the driveway over on this side. And don't you want the tree to stay on the west side of your house so it shades it in the summer and allows sunlight in the winter? Oh, I didn't think about that. Okay, now the owner talks to the architect again. Architect goes to contractor, can we do that? Yeah, sure, we can do that, no problem. Contractor back to the arborist, perfect. Now, contractor hires a subcontractor for a driveway. Well, subcontractors have to talk to the arborist as well, because once they're on site, there's a lag of communication between all these different levels, right? So keeping this map open for all parts involved, especially when, let's say the main goal is to preserve this one tree. The only common denominator there is the arborist for the protection side of it, right? The architect has the planning, the contractor has the managerial skills, and the subcontractors are putting the shovels in the ground. So the only common denominator is the person who is responsible for what happens to the living thing that's on that site. So a lot of times the arborist gets shoved down into the subcontractor level, and they are barely talked to by the contractor. The architect is long gone at this point. Maybe they'll come by if there's a wall that needs to be erected over 4 feet and they need an engineer involved. Like, that's barely the time that an architect will come back to the site after the plan is initiated. So keeping this line of communication open from the owner down to the subcontractor, everybody checking back in with each other, that's the key to this whole thing for preserving, not retaining trees on sites. That's my opinion. And this is something I want to make a sticker out of and put it on job boards. You know, like boom, this is in English and Spanish. Here you go. You know, like this needs to happen. You know, you want to do something, call this person. That person has to call this person, and that person can talk to this person who will relay it around and around and around. Okay. Planning, site design, and tree protection plans. You know, there's two usual approaches. The passive approach, where the site plan is drawn up, tree protection overlay is developed based on that plan, right? That's not what I like, but that's 95% of the time that's what happens. They make a site plan and then they say, how do we protect these trees based on this plan? What I prefer is the active approach, where the site plan and the tree protection plan are developed at the same time and in coordination with each other. Hey, let's figure out, you know, and that requires a lot from the arborist as well. They need to know minimum landscape architecture, you know, like that's why I took CAD classes, you know, like I can draw in CAD just as, not as well as a lot of people, but I know what it entails, and I know how pieces move. I know, you know, you have to know that foundations go out from the setbacks in the house, and you have to know all these other parts of it that are above and below ground. So, you know, the active approach is what I prefer to do and what I promote as a future of tree protection as far as that goes. So construction-related parameters, you have property boundaries, topography, existing drainage, footprint of structures, grading and drainage plan, location of curb cuts, underground utilities, overhead utilities, septic systems, areas for storage, material debris. The tree-related parameters that I want to cover at the same exact time, identification of the trees, sizes, conditions, approximate tree critical root zone, which we know how to calculate that, measurement of the lower crown elevation. Can machines even get through here? Can trucks even get through here? Do we need to do something about that beforehand? Pruning, whatever, so they don't get ripped off. Analysis of soil, canopy cover, and tree exposure, which we've all talked about. But these, you know, just as equally important at the same time, this is what I like to bring to the table right up front, you know. So steps for active tree protection planning: survey the trees on adjacent properties whose critical root zone overlaps with the project site, because we know when you're building around here, there's going to be a tree right across the property line whose roots are going to come into your property. And it will behoove everybody to figure out how to protect that tree just as much, you know, and if not more than the rest of the trees, because you don't want to be hit with some sort of, you know, lawsuit or something eventually. And you can't just do anything on your property when it relates to the health of a neighbor's tree. You can prune branches that come to your side, as long as it doesn't lead to the decline of the tree. Same thing with roots. You're allowed to cut roots back as long as it doesn't lead to the decline of that tree. Then you're responsible at that point. That's how property law is here. So, show all the trees on the site plan, overlay building footprint, other proposed structures, analysis between site design and an arborist, locate these utilities, establish limits of disturbance. Limits of disturbance are basically how far you can drive in, what you can bring, the weight of the machinery, storage stuff, materials, etc. Identify staging areas, separate the tree protection zone with tree protection fencing, right? So that is the fencing that we saw from that other picture, but a poorly designed plan, right? So big orange fencing, whatever, hey, stay out of this area, here's why, do not come into this area, do not take this fence down, blah, 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 blah. Provide detailed drawings. So here's a recap of what a critical root zone is and how you calculate it. You take the diameter of the tree and you multiply it in inches by 1 at a minimum. 1.25 is the average, or 1.5 is what I like to use. And then the result is the radius and protection that you need for the critical root zone, and that's where I put my tree protection zones. So an example of that is a 10-inch tree needs a 15-foot radius. That's a lot more than a lot of people will want to give up. So you're talking about a tree this big needs, you know, from here almost halfway through the pool table around it to be protected. A lot of people will be like, no, let's just cut that tree down because we're not going to send everybody around for that. You know, and that's usually what ends up happening. But when you have these big, nice heritage trees that people really want to keep, then you talk about 2 feet, 3 feet, Now you're about 60-foot zone of protection. So oftentimes they end up using the minimum, which is 1, which is still good, but you know, a 38-inch tree will require, you know, 38 feet of radius. So that's a good way to think about the math on that one. And that's just the math of the biology between root dangers and risks. Here's a cool thing from Europe. That's why it's in meters and on the metric. But this is just like trees and tree protection zones for architects and designers. So they're starting to focus on getting this information to the people up front. You know, ahead of whoever's designing this plan. Here's what you need to know. Here's, you know, a quick little diagram. Here it's less common, but it's, you know, we have a lot more land and trees than most places, in the UK at least. But I just liked how they put this all in one little thing and they could share that. And this goes out to like every architectural review committee over there. So it's pretty cool. Tree protection zone, same thing, kind of redundant, but you know, arborists define area surrounding the trunk intended to protect roots and soil within the critical root zone and beyond to ensure future health and stability. So, you know, using the drip line is what we've used historically, which is okay, but we all know like a drip line of an evergreen, like a nice spruce, will be much smaller than the critical root zone. So, you know, in order to eliminate that discrepancy between species, that's why we use the trunk method, or the trunk diameter method, based on DBH multiplied by whatever factor you decide. Other factors to consider: species tolerance to construction, relative tree age, and root connections. So remember, all these roots underground aren't isolated per tree. They usually graft with each other and they share resources. So affecting one tree's roots could have potentially, you know, dire results and impacts on the neighboring tree. Traffic, delivery, storage, and waste. Waste collection area, which is, I've drilled that in already, the line, gravel pit. Hopefully that will, like, you know, oh, I never thought about that. Pass that on, because that is something really important. Designated storage areas, stilted or off ground for, you know, lumber, trusses, roof material. Let's put them on something. It doesn't need to be on the ground, you know, preventing this gas exchange from roots that you are trying to save at the same time. Compaction relief, 6 to 8 inches of coarse mulch or load matting. A good example of this, and I'm not dogging anybody, if you go down here by the tennis courts and you see the tracks that they use to work on the creek rehabilitation, if they would have put 6 to 8 inches of mulch down there, there'd be a lot less compaction. They're doing a really good job of sticking to the same tracks every time, but they could have put 6 or 8 inches of mulch down. Luckily, they're pines that existed in an area that's already compacted, so they'll probably be just fine. But that's a good example that you can visually see the compaction. You know, go look at how much lower their tracks are than the surrounding, you know, area, and you'll be able to see that. So 6 to 8 inches of coarse mulch or load mats, either one works fine. Sorry, I didn't want to bust anybody.
We're over here feeling busted, that's okay.
Well, give me a call next time. So, you know, a lot of people say, well, I have to dig this trench here because I need a water line through this area. I need utilities to go through here. The machine I use, the air spade, can do this. So, you know, we can expose this whole root system underneath and everything, expose problems, put a complete tunnel underneath roots, install utilities, and fill it all back without affecting the roots in any negative way at all. Where before, you know, usually they would just cut this right here, and it would be done, and there'd be a problem. So that's like new technology, kind of, you know, that we're trying to promote the use of.
Does it get a little messy when you're running it? It's high pressure air, huh?
So if it's dry, it's terrible. It is like a dust storm. I mean, you know, excuse my personal information, but I shoot like dirt boogers for like 3 days. Like, you know, and I still wear like K95 mask and, you know, full PPE. Like I wear it all. Has anybody heard of like this thing called Navage? Mm-hmm. So when I started doing air spading a lot more, I got one of those. Every time I air spade now, I clean my sinus cavities out because, half the time when I'm air spading is to investigate rot. So I'll get into white rot or something, and I'll just be blasting fungal spores into my face and eyelids and nose and everything. Now, I've learned over the years, now I spray down the area first. And then it's a lot less messy, and I like to, you know, in my mind, if I can get a brown sugar system going, where when I'm, and it's just kind of churning it and making this nice brown sugar consistency, that's a lot less messy. Too wet, and you get the same mud splatters everywhere. But I put up barriers when I do it, you know, like I use like it's a 3-foot dog fence that unfolds into a big thing, and I put like these, you know, like the poster boards you can buy from Staples, and I clip them to that wherever, you know, with my stickers on and stuff. But you know, I make this big barrier. You know, I'm doing really important stuff. Stay back, you know. So I, you know, that's how I keep the mess down. And then of course, when you're done, it needs to be covered usually with like a light mulching or some sort of organic material, so you're not just exposing ground and causing more of a problem to begin with. But half the time, it's a lot like flossing, you know, like air flossing your teeth. It dries it out, it really breaks everything down, cleans everything up between roots. What I like mostly, 95% of the stuff I do, I expose girdling roots and I cut them. So that's my favorite thing to do is, oh look, a girdling root, cut it. And then if you ever cut a girdling root, it's probably one of the most satisfying things you can do for a tree. You cut one end and it just pops off. And that's like all the pressure that is being put on it from that buttress root. And it's like, oh man, like thank goodness I did that, you know. Anyway, so air spading for utilities is becoming more common, and it's very easy on the tree and nice to do. Oh, and it aerates the soil in the process, so win-win. Construction project, I call it the home stretch syndrome. People are getting antsy, they want to leave the site. This is when most things go wrong on a construction site at the very end, you know. So I'm not going to waste your time reading all this, but this is a pretty funny, you know, thing. There goes your internet. So, you know, everybody wants the thing to be done. You know, the owner's getting excited to move in. Everybody's been there for 6 months longer than they thought, blah, blah, blah. And that's the time when trees get kicked to the side in everybody's thoughts. Nicked, banged, busted, dug, whatever, you know. So seeing it through all the way is very important. Project completion, ongoing maintenance. Once barriers are removed, examine them, monitor the trees. You know, like I said, it could take up to 3 years following construction to really see any kind of negative impact. You know, essentially, like, this is all about just like when they move in or when you're done, that's not the end of it for the trees. They are still alive and they're still, you know, moving on. So monitoring them for the next several years is very important. So timeline map is just in reverse. So when they're finishing, subcontractors need to check with contractors, and I just did this in reverse so that when you're passing it back to the owner, it's still a big cycle of information, and that will leave the owner and the arborist to monitor the trees moving into the future. Same way it started with the owner and the arborist and the architect, basically making the plan for everything. So it's just a way to wrap it back up with communication and keeping that communication cycle going to the very end, so you don't have some, like I said before, a separate subcontractor like a landscaper coming in and not knowing all the other stuff that's been going on the site and why. Case study, so just real quick. A tree this is preserved versus retained, okay? So tree preserved, plan is developed before anything, communication map is followed, tree protection zones are created, the site was monitored, communication was maintained throughout the project, utilities were installed under the roots, landscaping included in the plan, monitoring continued for 3 years, the tree was preserved, the value of property was increased or increases. The tree is retained. Passive plan includes arborist after the fact, contractor dictates the actions on site, trees are fenced around trunks, site was not monitored, no communication was maintained, utilities installed through the roots, landscaping done separately, tree retained, then dies, retained tree cost to remove, value of property decreases. This is just a very simple to choose your own adventure things where to an outside observer it might be the same thing, preserved and retained, but to somebody like me it's completely different. So, I just threw this in there at the end to kind of recap everything into a little storyline.
Scott, back on that, if the tree's preserved and everything's followed, but the tree still dies for some, is there any responsibility of anybody other than the owner that was involved in all that?
So per site, per case study,
Yeah.
but also that is where I would include in my original contract, with the contractor, whether it's the arborist or the builder, if this tree dies within 3 years, here's what will happen. Whether it's a replacement tree or whatever it may be, just as an underlying safety protocol. Hey, we all know it could be something completely different. However, this is why we picked this site. It's very important to us. Let's add it into the contract. That's where I would put that into a contract, And it's not like, oh, the tree died, it's your fault. It's more like the tree died, somebody is contractually obligated to do something about it, versus like the owner's left with cost. And usually that involves, we'll try, like my company, our company policy is, oh, you have a declining tree, let's try to save it. Here's a cost for this and a cost to remove it. If the tree ends up dying, we take the cost of mitigating it off of the removal cost. That's how we do it for contract obligations like that. So it's kind of a win-win for a chance to preserve the tree where there's no added cost at the end. So, yep.
Can you revisit the work down there by the tennis courts? What did you say, 6 to 8 inches of mulch?
Yep, coarse mulch.
Okay, what kind of load are you looking on a 6 to 8 inch of coarse mulch?
What kind?
How heavy a vehicle?
Oh, up to 20,000 pounds easily.
Okay.
Yeah, dump truck full of rocks.
What if you got a 12,000 pound vehicle?
12,000 is fine.
Okay, we're fine.
Yeah, so 20,000 I think is good.
Right, we're good. That's a 12,000. They ran that once. They'll run it again out one time. And
Wait, you mean like with mulch or without mulch?
There's some mulch that right. No, without mulch. What's
without mulch, 7 is the cutoff
7
for
okay.
permanent compaction. But like I said, those pines sit on a little ridge. I didn't see any turns, which is good in your favor. It wouldn't hurt to go ahead and just add mulch now if they're going to go again.
We've got one track, one time in, one time out.
Yep.
The big one.
Yep.
The small one, 4,000 to 5,000
Yep.
pounds maybe.
The little skid steer.
That's the back
Yep.
and forth. I don't know what the weight of that one is. But
Just tell them not to turn. Obviously, I would push for mulch to be installed,
Right.
whatever. The damage is done from the bigger one. If it's a one-time in and out, again,
that's it. If
You
it's
know,
one time in, it'd be one time out.
I would focus on a post-examination of the pines. Make sure they're not suffering afterwards or have major root loss. Worst case scenario, they'll air spade their root collars and see if any of the major buttress roots were broken or disconnected. That's it.
That is a mulched area, as I recall.
Is it?
I think so.
I think it's just a pine needle.
There's pine needles there
Yeah,
for
it's
sure.
not, it's not that.
And I only know because I pass it all the
No,
time.
it's not extra heavy mulch, but it's just the pine needles.
Yeah.
And there is some depth to that.
Yeah.
2-3 inches.
Go look at it after this and just see what you find. Like dig down and see if there's, there might not be any roots right there. The pine root, because white pines have a taproot, so they're very good at going deep. Like they're good in sandy soils. They're good in soils. If it was like a hop hornbeam, or an ironwood, it would be detrimental. A white pine, or even better, would be a Virginia pine. You could probably, they have a higher tolerance for compaction than these other species. So like in that specific case, it's a good example of seeing what a track can do. If you hired me as an arborist to look at it, I'd probably be like, it's not ideal, but it's probably not going to negatively affect these trees, especially if there's a post, action of remulching that track, And I would just use like aged pine fines since it's already in that area, just to allow more surface roots. Because the biggest problem with that is when it rains now, the rain is going to follow those tracks and the compacted dirt, right? Somewhere, hopefully down to the creek, without the sediment. But, there's no sponge, and it's already on that kind of islandy thing. So just giving it a little extra advantage with water availability is what I would like, recommend. And you're talking, just basic math in my head, 25 bags of 8 time fines, some volunteers, throw them out.